Psychology from the University of Virginia. Her work has appeared in numerous media outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, Psychology Today, the BBC, and NPR. Her TED Talk, Why 30 is Not the New 20, is one of the most watched with more than 10 million views. Dr. Jay maintains a private practice in Charlottesville. This evening, we are so privileged to hear from Dr. Jay, but that's not all. You, the parents, will have the opportunity through her talk to ask questions by writing them in the chat. This workshop is for you, so don't be shy and make it all yours. Now, please welcome Dr. Meg Jay.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much for that nice welcome. And I thank the Shapiro family for having me here tonight. It is a pleasure to be here to talk to you. Jonathan, I'm going to ask you to bump me to the next slide. I'm here tonight to talk to you about not just about my book, Supernormal, but really about what I learned in writing the book and researching the book and in working with countless clients and students who have have had to be resilient. The subtitle of Supernormal is The Untold Story of Adversity and Resilience. And so a lot of people ask me, well, what's the untold story? And the untold story, or part of the untold story we're going to tell tonight, is that adversity, especially in childhood, is a lot more common than maybe we think it is, or maybe than we would like to think it is. So if we go to our next slide, I want to just quickly show you the 10 most common adverse childhood experiences. You might have heard of these as called ACEs. So here they are: loss of a parent or a sibling through death or divorce, alcoholism or drug abuse in the home, mental illness in a parent or a sibling, emotional, physical, or sexual abuse by way of a parent or a sibling or a trusted other, bullying, usually at school or in the neighborhood, domestic violence, growing up with poverty or neglect, or having a parent in jail. So these are the most common childhood adversities. And if we go to the next slide, you may be asking yourself, well, what do those have to do with me or my child? That was a question I heard a lot when the book first came out, and I was on podcasts and giving talks like this one back then in person. But it's a good question, but I think one thing to understand is that the ACEs are more common than maybe we realize, that it's estimated that 75% of us, 75% of kids out there are growing up with at least one of the ACEs or more. So of course, these days, what does adversity have to do with your child? Maybe even more than that. And that if we go to the next slide, it's probably just a matter of time before we start to think of or start to recognize the COVID-19 as maybe the most common ACE or childhood adversity, at least in this period of time. So I've put it down here at the bottom of the list. It should probably be at the top of the list because even though some people are being more affected than others by the pandemic and by the associated losses and restrictions, it's certainly touching every child in some way or another. So I think it makes sense for now to think of it as a childhood adversity and to learn from, what do we know about the ACEs, about what are their effects on kids, and how can we be resilient in the face of those adversities? And to map that onto handling the pandemic. So if we go to the next slide, I want to quickly just do a little bit of background on ACEs and why they matter so much. So what we know about childhood adversities is most of the most common ones, the 10 that I mentioned, plus the pandemic, that's 11, is that they're chronic stressors. So having a parent who's an alcoholic or having a sibling with mental illness or being on lockdown in a pandemic, these are not one-time stressors. They're not just stressors for one day or 1 week or 1 month, but they're stressors that we're experiencing day after day, month after month, in some cases for the ACEs, year after year. And so what happens is that as we try to absorb that stress, our stress hormones rise. And over time, that creates a cumulative strains on our bodies and our brains. Our bodies and our brains do not want to be exposed to our stress hormones hour after hour, day after day. Our bodies need a break from that. And when the stressor continues for days or months or years, then our bodies don't get the breaks that they need. And so what happens is that that leaves us vulnerable to various physical and mental health problems, both in the here and now and down the line as that strain adds up over time. Another thing that happens, and this is probably a bit more true with the 10 ACEs that I mentioned, whether that's living with domestic violence or having a parent in jail, is that a narrative can begin to be formed for kids where they have a perception that they are different or damaged compared to their peers, or that their lives are different or damaged because of these ACEs that they've lived with. But I think on the one hand, as more and more of us have learned about what the ACEs are, how common they are, and why they can be toxic to our brains and our bodies, that's been very useful and important information. But I think it's also important to tell the rest of the story, which is even though the ACEs can be detrimental to our brains and our bodies, that it doesn't have to be that way, and that there are ways that we can be resilient in the face of adversity. So that's really what my book Supernormal is about. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. So if we go to the next slide talks about how in Supernormal, and I won't bore you with the details of the publishing industry, but if you're out there looking for the book, you'll notice that the hardcover has a title, The Untold Story of Adversity and Resilience. The paperback has a different title, The Secret World of the Family Hero. It's the same book, it's the same story, and it's really about shifting the story or shifting the conversation from one where we just focus on adversity and what adversity does to us, and shifts the conversation also over to resilience of what we do in response and how we get through tough times. It changes the conversation from what feels abnormal or what might be abnormal about me because I've gone through this experience, to helping people consider maybe you're not abnormal, maybe you're supernormal. The word supernormal means above the average or expectable. And there are a lot of ways out there that a lot of kids, teens, young adults have really kind of beat expectations, and their lives have turned out better than they expected, even after significant adversity. So it sort of holds that possibility open that things can go maybe better than we expect, even after adversity. And it's also a book or a conversation that changes the position of the child, the teen, the young adult, from a victim of circumstance to a protagonist in their own lives, that it shows them as people with agency and with others in their environment that may be able to help them sort of get to a better place. So in shifting the conversation from adversity to resilience, I've talked about what adversity is, or at least I mentioned the most common ones. So let's talk a little bit about resilience, what it is and oh, I'm sorry. Let's go to the next slide. And before I talk about resilience, I want to mention this is one of my favorite quotes by Bessel van der Kolk. For those of you who know, he's a renowned thinker and writer and worker in the area of trauma. And he says, healing is as much about remembering how we survived as it is about what is broken. And I think sometimes when we want to pay attention to what's gone wrong in people's lives, we forget to notice what they did to get through it. We forget to talk about not just what happened that hasn't been so great, but to focus on what that person did or what the community was able to do that showed them how we get through times like now, times like the pandemic, or difficult times in childhood. Okay, so let's talk quickly at the next slide about resilience. So I'm going to give you the American Psychologists Association definition here. So resilience is adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, and significant sources of stress. So notice that resilience is not a quality. It's not something that we are born with, and we either have it or we don't have it. It's not like, um, intelligence. It's not extroversion. It's not introversion. It's not something that some people tend toward and some people just don't. It's really more of a process, and it's more of an action. It's more of an outcome. And so that begs the question, if resilience is adapting well in the face of adversity, then how do I adapt well? How do I help my kids adapt well or be resilient during tough times? Well, fortunately for all of us, our brains and our bodies are already hardwired to try to be resilient, that we have certain mechanisms within us that kind of direct us toward what we need. And so some of what we're going to talk about is what those are and how you can help that happen for your child or for your family or your community or your school. So, how do we adapt? Well, two of the mechanisms that are hardwired into our body are fight or flight, which everybody's heard of, but I'm still going to talk about for a minute. And then also one we've heard less about, which is called tend and befriend. So let's talk a minute about the fight instinct on the next slide. So you'll notice here, and you might have noticed from the book cover, that there's a central metaphor in the book Supernormal, and that is of the superhero. And this really came from my clients, many of whom said that when they were growing up and times were difficult, that they often identified with a superheroic character, that they kind of identified with someone who role modeled for them this kind of ability to be strong or to battle back or to try to fight the good fight. And so, our fight or flight instincts in the modern days, obviously, fight is not necessarily about, putting your fists up as much as it is about being an active problem solver, seeing what you can do to improve your situation, um, or, kind of tapping into that fighter within. So, something important to think about, that when kids are trying to be resilient, they're tapping into fight or flight. And what that means is that by definition, resilience is a struggle, that resilient people do struggle, that a real misconception that we have out there, probably the leading misconception about resilience, is that resilient people don't struggle, that we say they just bounce back from whatever goes wrong in life. And, we might bounce back from a bad day at work or having the flu or not being invited to a party, but we don't bounce back from the ACEs that I just talked about. I don't think people are going to bounce back. Oops, if there we go. Go back. There we go. I don't think that people are going to bounce back from the pandemic. Now, do I think we can recover? Yes, and we're going to get to that. But what's important to think about is that being resilient, it is a struggle. It is a fight. It's a lot of work. And so it's important to see that even though resilient people are kind of working on their muscles of being strong, they're not invulnerable, that we can't be in fight or flight mode all the time. Or we certainly can't be in fight mode all the time. So that brings us to the next one, flight, that it's fight or flight, not just fight, right? That we need both of those. And I think flight gets a lot less attention than it should. But resilient people, one thing they do to adapt well is they get some healthy distance from their problems. They try to find a way to sort of rise above or get away or create some space for themselves. Now, you might be thinking, well, the pandemic is pretty inescapable. How can I get some space from the pandemic? But we can learn a lot from the other ACEs of what it's like to be a kid in a family where there's domestic violence or who has a sibling with severe mental illness, that these are problems that also kids can't, quote, get away from, or they can't quite escape. But we learn to find ways to have healthy escapes. So many of my clients, both this year in dealing with the pandemic or in other years dealing with other ACEs, they talk about, I just need to lose myself in my books. I need to just go for a walk in nature. Sometimes I watch my favorite show on Netflix just to take a mental break from what's going on. And I think maybe we don't recognize or give ourselves credit for how healthy that is and the value that has in our lives, that we need to be able to take emotional breaks from stressors that aren't going anywhere, at least not in the short run. Okay. Um, so if we go to the next one, I talked about fight or flight, and then next, tend or befriend. So we hear less about tend and befriend, but this is really important because fight or flight are very activating responses to stress, whereas tend and befriend can be deactivating in a good way. So the tend response is kind of an impulse to take care of other people or ourselves when times are tough. And so oftentimes you'll see resilient kids, resilient teens, resilient families say, I don't want to feel stuck with my problem. I'm going to be part of the solution. I want to focus on how can I do some helping right now or some healing right now. That we know that it's good to be good, that when we feel like we can help our neighbors during tough times or help ourselves when the going is rough, that is both restorative, but it also gives us a sense of agency and a sense of control and also some optimism that there are some solutions out there. So there's a lot of power in self-compassion, self-care, and not just helping other people, but also learning to take care of yourself. So for many of my clients, I have said you need to give yourself permission this year just to take it easy in however you need to take more baths or light a candle and just relax a little bit more. That I think maybe sometimes we forget how chronically stressed our brains and our bodies are in this very unusual circumstance that we're in. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, uh, it's good to be good and tend to ourselves and others, but I think we have to remember that resilient people can't do it all, and that part of being resilient is not trying to go it alone, that resilient people actually band together with others who can help. And I often tell parents or other practitioners that one thing that led me to write the book Supernormal was that I had a lot of clients in my office who were very successful or doing well in school or doing well in work, yet what was going on at home or in their communities was quite difficult. And what was interesting is that they rarely saw themselves as resilient. And part of the reason was because they had struggled, and in that bounce back sort of explanation of resilience, they didn't see themselves in that explanation because they'd struggled, even though, as we just talked about, resilience is a struggle. But another thing that they said a lot was, well, if I was resilient, I wouldn't be here, I wouldn't need you. And this is really something that we need to change the messaging on for ourselves, for our kids, for our students. And that is that resilient people don't go it alone. They can't do it all themselves. That one thing resilient people do is that they use the resources around them, whether those resources are people who care, neighbors who care, grandparents who care, teachers who care, after school programs that care, that they figure out how to not be alone with the problem. What's one thing that's interesting is that a bigger predictor of the impact that trauma or adversity has on us down the line is not how severe the trauma was at the time, as much as it is how alone we felt with the problem, both during the problem and after. So being able to feel that somebody knows or somebody cares or somebody is supporting us while something difficult is going on does a world of good in terms of ameliorating some of those kind of brain and body stress effects. But it's also never too late, that talking about an adversity after the fact and leaning on someone a year later, a month later, a decade later, we know that that's partly where healing comes from as well. So if we go to the next slide, I'm actually going to talk about this befriend bit a little bit more because I think it's so important. There's such a kind of a rap out there about resilience that on the one hand, it's just bouncing back, and that people who are resilient, they're just never bothered and they don't need anyone and they don't struggle, they don't have problems. Now, resilient people may make it look that way, but it really isn't that way for them. And sometimes the other conversation is they're just gritty. They just grit, 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 and they just, get their way through everything and never need anyone. And neither of those are true. That being able to lean on others or having positive relationships in our lives has an enormous impact on whether kids, teens, young adults, people of all ages are able to adapt well. So one of my favorite quotes on this is from Bruce Perry, and he says, research on the most effective treatments to help child trauma victims might accurately be summed up this way. What works best is anything that increases the quality and number of relationships in the child's life. So at the end of the day, practitioners can argue all day about, should it be psychodynamic treatment? Should it be cognitive behavioral treatment? Should it be dialectical behavioral treatment? But what really works, especially when we're talking about trauma and adversity, is improving the relationships in the child's life, whether that's one good one or 5 pretty good ones. It doesn't really matter as much as that we increase the number or quality of people that are available to support and to care. And so that might sound a little, hokey or cliche that love heals. But I think I have time just to spend another moment or two on this, because I think it's important for people to understand the neurobiology there. So remember a few slides back when I talked about when the brain experiences uncertainty or threats or stressors in the environment, the amygdala is activated, stress hormones go up, and our brains and our bodies are strained and activated. And we don't like that over time. That's going to provide a lot of wear and tear on the body and the brain. Well, what happens when we're in a safe or soothing situation or space, or with a safe or soothing person, then that unwinds, that our brains and our bodies downshift, our stress hormones decline, and we're able to calm ourselves in ways that it's called the undoing effect, that all the kind of the accumulated stress that we talk about, which is the danger of ACEs, unwinds over time. And so over just the same way that a chronic stressor can build up stress in the brain and the body over time, having good people, having good spaces, having good places in someone's life unwinds that over time. And over time, the good adds up, and the good can outweigh the bad. So we talked about fight or flight, tend and befriend. These are things that people do to, quote, adapt well. These are different roads to resilience. There's no one road, there's no one quality. There are different strategies that we use. They're all important, they're all valid. And being able to tap into these in difficult times, no matter what the childhood adversity is what leads people to feel resilient, to feel like I'm able to adapt. So let's look at, in the next slide, I want to show you a shortened version of the Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale. And I'm showing you this because these are the sort of statements that resilient teens, resilient children, and resilient adults, these are the sort of statements that they agree with. They say things like, I'm able to adapt when changes occur. I can deal with whatever comes my way. I try to see the humorous side of things when I'm faced with problems. Having to cope with stress can make me stronger. I tend to recover after illness, injury, or other hardships. I believe I can achieve my goals even if there are obstacles. I am not easily discouraged by failure. I think of myself as a strong person when dealing with life's challenges. I am able to handle unpleasant feelings like sadness, fear, and anger. And in times of stress, I know where to find help. So these are the sort of items, statements that resilient folks agree with or say are true about themselves. So if we go to the next slide, these are the same 10 statements, but I just bolded the words that I want to stand out for us. So these are statements about I can adapt, I can deal, I can see the humor, I can cope, I can recover, I believe in myself, I'm not easily discouraged, I'm strong, I can handle unpleasant feelings. That doesn't mean I don't have them or I need to get rid of them, but I can handle them. I'm going to feel sad or scared or angry sometimes, and that's okay. I can handle it. And I know where to find help. So I think we could probably all agree that this is the way we would like to feel when times are tough, when there's an adversity in our lives, and throughout the pandemic. This is what we would also like our kids to be able to say, yeah, I think and feel all these things. But it's probably also true that sometimes we don't think those things, that we think other things. So let's talk about what we might be thinking instead that keeps us from tapping into that sort of optimism and confidence that we can be, that our kids can be resilient right now. So in the next slide, I want to show you some what I'm calling pandemic pitfalls, but really they're common thinking errors that come up. So when our brains are presented with uncertain or maybe somewhat threatening situations, I've put on here 4 common thinking errors. One of those is what's called negative bias, that we tend to see what is wrong in the situation or what might go wrong. And in research, psychology researchers talk about this, the bad is stronger than the good, that in an uncertain situation, the bad is going to sort of leap out at us and take all of our attention. And that makes a lot of sense. That's protective, that we think, well, I don't really know what's going to go on here, so I need to be sure that I'm ready. I'm ready for what could go sideways. But it also leaves us really only sometimes able to see the negative side of things. And we also have a tendency in uncertain situations towards catastrophic thinking. So this is worst case scenario thinking of this situation is going to ruin my life. This is going to ruin my child's life, that this is going to have a serious negative impact over the long run. And I've seen a lot of news stories in the paper about that recently, about young people's careers starting in the pandemic or never going to recover, or kids, kind of dealing with the pandemic and the associated lockdowns and losses are never going to recover. And I'm not sure we know that that's true. We're going to come back to that in a minute, but that's catastrophic thinking, imagining that the worst is the most likely scenario. Next, we've got black or white thinking, which is, of course, the tendency to see something as all good or all bad and having a difficult time imagining that maybe they go together. And then the last is counterfactual thinking, spending a lot of time thinking about how, everything really would have been better if my parents weren't this way, my sibling wasn't this way, my life wasn't this way this year, that we kind of imagine the best case scenario of if only this was the situation, my life would be better. So these are very common ways to think when we're in uncertain situations, and they get in the way of us being able to tap into some of those statements that I mentioned above in the resilience scale. So what can people do instead? If we go down to the next slide. So here I've got pandemic possibilities. So instead of when we notice ourselves kind of getting stuck in the negative bias of noticing everything that's been wrong with this year, everything bad that could mean for ourselves or our careers or our kids, is to try to help yourself notice what's gone right, what might go right, to work to see the good or the possible. And I don't necessarily mean to replace the negative with the positive as much as I mean to allow yourself to also see the positive. And so I was on an earlier podcast or an earlier talk today, and someone was asking, how as a parent can I help my kid be more resilient during the pandemic? And one way is to think aloud, to role model this aloud, to say things like, gosh, it seems easy to notice all the things we've missed out on this year, and those are all real, and it's sad or difficult. But I'm also noticing some things that maybe we wouldn't have done. So many families have said, we've gotten closer as a family because of this year, or we've connected more with nature than we ever have before. Or some kids are noticing some of the upsides of being able to do school online that they hadn't noticed before, and being able to sort of concentrate and be a better student. It just depends on your family and your child. But to help kids see you working on not just noticing what the pandemic has taken away, but maybe what it has added, that it's certainly a unique opportunity to learn some new things. And we have to sometimes do the work to figure out, what is it that we might have learned from this year? Next, instead of catastrophic thinking of this is going to ruin my kid's trajectory, or this is going to ruin my career, this is going to ruin my life, to be able to actually tolerate uncertainty of, we really don't know what the impact that this is going to have on our kids as people, as students, as workers. And that it's very possible that life can recover and we can recover, and that we just can't we can't quantify the negatives and the positives and figure out yet quite how this is going to stack up. So maybe just to add a little bit of openness of that it's easy to jump to that worst case scenario thinking, but we really don't know what this is going to mean for ourselves and our families a year from now. And maybe we just leave it open. That's something that kids have a tough time doing, but we can role model that for them. Next, instead of black or white thinking, you can role model black and white thinking. And this kind of goes up with what we just talked about with negative bias, is to sort of show your kids that most situations are mixed, that their dream jobs are going to be bad days at work, even in their dream jobs, that marriages have upsides and downsides. Raising our kids has its good days and its bad days. And certainly the pandemic has been a mixed bag. And I'm not minimizing the negative parts or the difficult parts as much as I'm saying that it's cognitively quite an achievement for people to be able to sort of hold the good and the bad together and let those go together and not have the bad ruin the good, but to say, sometimes the bad and the good do go together, that's part of life. And we have to figure out a way to live with both together. And then last, instead of counterfactual thinking, which is sort of comparing what you're getting this year with what we all imagine we would have had without the pandemic had this year gone to plan, is to not compare and despair, which is usually the way it goes when we compare what we have with something we imagined that would have been better, but just to stay with the way things are, that it doesn't really do anybody a lot of good to compare what they have with what someone else has, or what we imagine we would have had if we'd chosen something different or done something different. There's very few scenarios where that works out well cognitively. So to just help your kids or help yourself and role model, just really think out loud while you're doing this of, it's easy to think about all the stuff we might have done, or, all the ways school could have gone better, but I'm not sure what we'll gain from that, or, we just don't really know how the year would have gone. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, really what the pandemic, if we think about it, I mentioned it earlier up in one of the ACE slides, that in a way, this is the most common childhood adversity that kids are currently exposed to. And there's a real growth opportunity here, not just in the ways I described or the ways I'm going to talk about, but just that in and of itself, that usually most of the adversities that kids grow up with they're secret, or they're not public, or people don't know what's going on at my house, or they don't know what's happening in my neighborhood. But this is an adversity that's public, and there's no shame or blame involved. And it's something that we all share. That one of, I think, the struggles of working with people who've grown up with adversity is they feel like they're in the minority, like they're different from other people. That, well, my parent is in jail, but most people's parents aren't in jail. They can't understand me. I don't have anyone I can talk to, no one I can connect with about this. Of course, the ACEs are more common than we would like to believe, but without a doubt, the pandemic is affecting everyone. So this is really an opportunity to kind of take on what's an adversity, what does it do to us, how does it stress our bodies and our brains, and then how do we try to adapt well. And this is an adversity that no one is to blame for, and no one can really make go away, or kind of problem solve their way out of, as much as we're all sort of learning to cope together. So it's a real opportunity to be an example or a template for handling all the other adversities to come, because I would love to think that this is the last stressor that our kids are ever going to deal with, but we know it isn't. So, so if we think about fight, flight, tend, and befriend in the context of we've got this pandemic, you've probably been doing these things, your kids have been doing these things. They may not have labeled it this, or they may not have recognized it, but I'm guessing you've all been quite resilient all year long already. And maybe similar to a lot of my clients who come in, they don't see that in themselves because, a la Bessel van der Kolk, they haven't remembered or paid attention to, what did I do to get through that situation? How can I remember how I survived? So I think I would like to hope that we're at the point where the world is going to begin to open up again. Um, maybe things are going to get back to something that looks familiar soon. But as that happens, people are going to be talking about their pandemic year. They're going to be reflecting on the pandemic year, trying to make sense of it. So one suggestion I have for parents, and I'm doing this myself as a parent, is kind of helping us remember and reflect on and sort of reminisce about how we've been getting through this, or things that we did to survive and even to thrive. And maybe these are things that we wouldn't have done without the pandemic. So, so if we think about it from the fight perspective, now, like I said before, there's not a lot any of us could do to make this pandemic go away. But a lot of kids and teens out there are tapping into that inner fighting spirit of, I'm not going to let this defeat me. This year isn't going to define me. This isn't going to ruin my schooling. This isn't going to, ruin my relationship with my sibling or with my friends. That I'm going to figure out a way to get through this year, in a way that's healthy for me. And it's interesting, I receive a lot of emails from 20 somethings because I've written a very popular 20 something book in addition to Supernormal. And they usually fall into two buckets. One is 20 somethings will email and they'll say, help, the pandemic is happening, during my defining decade. What do I do? Which is good. They're trying to figure out, how do I fight back? How do I survive this? And the other bucket are people who email and they say, you know what? I have decided that during the pandemic and I'm on lockdown, I'm going to sit home and figure out, how do I plan for what to do when life opens up again? How do I get ready to hit the ground running? So in both cases, people are grappling with, how do I make this turn out well? How do I have this not define me? And I think that that's something that we can do with our kids, is to help them see how they are sort of tapping into that fighting spirit of, that this doesn't have to be a school ender or a life ender for them. It's a difficult time to get through, but we're going to find a way to get through it, to have that confidence and that optimism. Next, with flight, we might want to help our kids notice, so that they can use in the future, what are ways that they have this year practiced getting some space. Because This isn't an adversity that we can get away. We can't move to the other side of the country to get away from it. There's nowhere to go to get away from the pandemic. So how have we been getting away from it in our own lives? How have we been taking sort of healthy emotional breaks? And I think some of the things I mentioned before is, kids are saying, well, I'm using my reading, or I'm playing card games with my siblings, or I'm watching Netflix, or I'm taking walks in nature, but to really help them see that that's a coping mechanism. That is something that they're actively choosing to do to reduce their stress, to adapt well, and to survive this pandemic. And the reason this is important is because if people don't know that they're doing that, they don't realize that they've got that tool. They don't kind of reflect on that as experience to own that when times get tough and there's nothing I can do about it, there are still ways I can cope, that I can take a walk, I can read a book, I can take a bath, I can find a way to protect myself emotionally. Next, for tend and befriend, I think a lot of kids and families this year have been more aware than maybe ever before of some of the vulnerabilities in their communities, or some of the people around them who are struggling. And so finding a way to get involved, whether that's, we drop off some groceries for our neighbor because they're elderly and, maybe shouldn't be going out to the store as much. I'm working with a family who's getting involved in meal delivery, a delivery service that delivers food to people who, can't go out and get it. I just kind of realize helping people be a little bit more compassionate and a little bit more aware that as much as we're struggling, there are also people in our community that are struggling as well, or maybe even more. And how can we tap into that in a way that feels meaningful and not artificial? It's not, sometimes I think we want to foster altruism in kids, and we try to figure out ways to tap into doing good in the community. But I think the pandemic has really offered an opportunity that the kids immediately understand that, families are suffering much like they are, and in some cases, maybe more. That I worked with a family over the holidays who usually travels during the holidays, and this year they weren't able to do that. So they took the money that they would normally spend for traveling, and they used that to be involved with an organization that was getting holiday gifts for kids whose parents had lost their jobs. And so that was kind of a new way for the kids to tap into doing good in their communities that they weren't doing before. And then, of course, to learn, and this goes along with the flight to a certain extent, to take this time this year to learn how important it is to take care of yourself and be good to yourself, that it's okay to have bad pandemic days and to really, really hate the pandemic on some days, and to be frustrated and sad and angry. And that sometimes you can't worry about other people. You just need to take care of yourself, that that's a healthy coping mechanism as well. And then last, but definitely not least, is the befriend instinct. And I think one of the big, big challenges of the pandemic is that it's made this one of all of them maybe the most difficult. And as I talked about a few slides prior, arguably this is the most important, if not one of the most important, is not feeling alone in difficult times. And so I would say helping your kids connect however they can in a way that's healthy, and kind of following the norms in your community around what's going on with lockdowns and restrictions, but helping them see if they're struggling because they haven't seen friends or they haven't connected, what are other ways can they connect, whether that's on Zoom or over the phone, or going for walks with friends when maybe normally they would have done something different. But just really any way that we can find ways to connect. I think this year has also shown people maybe the extent to which we took for granted, how important connecting was. That this year, as we've been less able to connect than in previous years, I think we're really seeing some of the science behind that. If we really need that as humans, we're born to connect, not to be alone in times of stress. So I'm going to end with the last slide, and that is that everybody has their own pandemic story. And yours is going to be different from mine, to kind of show you that we're all in this together. I'll tell you a little bit about at least my pandemic story, or how it began. And that is that in January of 2020, I got on a ship with 500 college students and my children. And we were going on a trip around the world. It's called Semester at Sea. And I was teaching supernormal. And I had taken my kids out of school, and we were going to visit 12 countries, and we were going to see the Great Wall and the Taj Mahal and the markets in Morocco and the tulips in the Netherlands. And of course, we were in Asia in January and on a ship. And so none of this ended up happening. And we actually spent most of the next 70 days on a ship, unable to get off. And so I was teaching supernormal on this voyage. And I remember telling my class that, of course, took my kids out of school, and we came on this journey because I wanted them to see the Taj Mahal and the Great Wall and all the great things I just mentioned. But that I really believed that in the long run, they would learn more from learning together with other people who are grappling with it. What do you do when life goes sideways? How do you cope? How do you adapt well? And as crushed as I was to not go to the Taj Mahal or the Great Wall, I knew in my heart of hearts that as long as we were safe and healthy at the end of all this, that honestly, my kids would get more out of that experience of getting through something difficult with people who cared and people who were sort of actively working to adapt, that was going to be a better learning experience for them, as much as I would have preferred a different learning experience. So I guess our pandemic story, rather than it being a story about how unlucky we were, about what a terrible trip that we've had, we've never talked about it that way. We have definitely recognized how disappointed we were, how hard it was sometimes, that we really were wishing for and hoping for something else. But without question, by the end of it, we felt more capable, more confident, more caring. I think my kids came away feeling stronger and wiser. And what I've seen is that, this all happened for us by mid-April. So we actually came back to the US right when the pandemic was beginning. We'd been dealing with it for 2 or 3 months already. So, and what I've noticed is that they have kind of handled the rest of the year maybe a bit more easily than they might have otherwise, because we had already done that work. And so I think for all of us, we're having our pandemic year, and as much as we would rather not be having it, and that the stressors are real and they're difficult, it's been very long. The winter's been really hard for me. That I think we can still help our kids have takeaways from this year that are going to help them see themselves as resilient and as capable and confident and caring and stronger and wiser, and that's going to serve them, because unfortunately there's going to be another adversity and another adversity in their lives as they grow. So I'm going to end it there, and then I know we're going to do Q&A for the rest of the time, which I look forward to.
Super. So if you have any questions, can you please put it into the chat box, please?
And Jonathan, would you like me to read the questions, or would you?
Yes, please. Would you read the questions and then answer them, please?
I'd be glad to. Okay. What are the type of talking about it with younger children? Tips. Okay. Yeah, so your child better than I do. I think we, you know, put it obviously in terms that they can understand of that, you know, just like there are good days and bad days, that, you know, there are difficult years and less difficult years. And this is a difficult year that, you know, there's a lot of people who have been sick from this illness, and we're working hard to keep everyone healthy and everyone safe. And that's what we're all doing together. But to do that is going to require us making some tough choices and missing out on some things we would like to do. But I think that, especially with younger kids, to help them remember that there will be more opportunities, that, you know, I know you're sad about not going to see grandma this year, and she really misses you. And, you know, I hope everyone's Zooming with grandma and all that, but to say, you know, we're going to do that next year. That's something we're still going to get to do, to help them see that this will end, and that the things that they're disappointed about not being able to do this year, that there's every reason to believe they'll be able to do it next year. And, you know, I think just keeping it as simple as that, and not explaining questions they're not asking, but just really addressing what their concerns are, what they're missing out on, what they're sad about, what they're scared about, but really saying that, you know, we're all working, the whole world is pulling together to get through this year together. Let's see. I thank you for this person who wrote, I find my children are more resilient than me. I love that. I have to say, when I was on semester at sea, man, those college students, I mean, they just, I, I won't go into the details, but the morning we found out we weren't going to India was a big crusher for me. And, you know, we get this email, and in my class that day, we were actually talking about the benefits of exercise. We just were. And one of the plans was to go up on the ship's deck, and one of the students was on the dance troupe in her college. So she was going to lead us all into dance, because I didn't think they'd want a calisthenics class by me. So anyway, this is what we were supposed to do. And about 10 minutes before that, we get this email that we're no longer going to India. We're going to do 2 more weeks on the ship and try to get off in the next country, which didn't happen. And I, you know, dragged myself into class, and I said, you know, I really want to respect how disappointed y'all are probably feeling and how crushed you are. I know I am. And, you know, if you don't feel you can go up on deck and do a dance, we don't have to do that. And man, nothing was going to keep them from getting up on the deck and doing their dance. And so I definitely had that experience. I learned as much from my students and from my kids as they learned from me about being resilient. And so it's interesting. I think we adults and kids have different things to offer each other. I see my own kids of like, no big deal. Yeah, we'll do it another time. I'm still having fun. I'm still okay. That oftentimes they're more able to do that than I am, because I'm thinking more about, you know, the details. But I think what we can offer our kids, that is how to articulate, like, wow, you have been so great this year about finding a way to sort of stay busy or find things to do even when there's not a lot to do, or you've really done a good job this year of just not giving up or just not losing hope. And so I think our kids just naturally do tend to be resilient. And what we can do is really show them that, so they own it. And at the end of the year, they're like, man, I was really resilient this year. Because I would suspect, based on my work with clients, that a lot of kids won't have realized how resilient they've been this year, when really, I mean, I think so many have.
Meg, I'm going to help you out here in terms of the questions.
Thank you.
So one of it is on social media screen time, and you know, obviously getting them off of it when this is all they do, especially now during the you know, Corona. But
Right.
also deal with kids who are already negative. You know, we have one question here: rewiring a 13-year-old who's already so negative, and then compounded by, you know, by the pandemic. How would you just talk to a child like that?
Yeah, so quickly I'll address the screen time. That's a tough one. I mean, I think this is a one-off this year in 1,000 ways. And as you might imagine, I am not a mom who allows a free-for-all with screen time. I know all the research. We're pretty conservative about how much time our kids are allowed to be on screens. With this year, they're Zooming 8 hours a day for school. My kids haven't been in school for a year. And so I have accepted that they're going to be on their screens for school, and that of course I can't monitor whether or not they're also chatting with their friends or whatever. And, I recognize they really need that. And so, I mean, I think I have, to a certain extent, been compassionate with my kids and myself that, normal rules may not apply within reason. I still think there are a lot of healthy boundaries that parents can set around screen time, of that in our house, all the devices, like, they're programmed to go to sleep at 9 p.m. So even though I do want my kids connecting with their friends, they don't need to be connecting at midnight. No good connections happen after midnight at this age, I don't think. But or this devices don't wake up until 8 in the morning. So we have breaks where, they're just going to have to find something else to do and connect with their siblings or mom and dad over dinner or whatever the case may be. So, on the one hand, we've said, any interaction is good interaction, but we still have boundaries over certain websites or apps that we don't have on phones or on devices. We have internet, content monitoring, so that, certain internet content isn't allowed in. And then hours of the day that we're just device free. So I think those are still healthy choices, even in the pandemic. But during the day, I recognize they're going to be talking to their friends more on their screens than usual.
Okay.
Okay, so the question about a kid who tends to be negative, and this is, the kids do, they have their temperaments. I mean, there's a certain amount of our temperamental tendencies that we're born with. That doesn't mean your child can't be resilient. It just means their negative bias is strong. So they're going to have to work a bit harder to kind of see both sides. And I definitely wouldn't present it as a glass half full kind of situation, because nobody likes that. As a matter of fact, on semester at sea, they asked me to give this kind of a pep talk to the students who, as I told you, sometimes they needed it less than the faculty did, I think. But one thing I was very clear about is that I wasn't going to get up there and give them a glass half full talk, that there is no question that there was a lot of struggle and heartbreak. A lot of families had sacrificed a lot to get their kids on this voyage, and a lot was lost. But what I did is I got up there and I gave them, a glass is never half empty or half full. It's usually always both. And so can we work on ways of honoring the negative of, I see how difficult this has been and how much you're struggling or feeling like you've lost. But can we also see some of the good that's happening around you that I feel like you're missing out on, or ways you're not owning that you've really done well in this situation. I don't know your child's age, or I don't know the child, you said 13, but there's actually a really good TED Talk about this called, I won't remember the title, but I think it's Allison Ledgerwood, and it's something like Tips for Positive Thinking, although the title's terrible, but the talk is really good. And it's about gain frame thinking versus loss frame thinking. And for a smart teenager, it does a good job of unpacking how crafty our brain is, and how, given two situations, we'll remember the losses every time and the gains just fly on by. And so that can be a way to kind of get them thinking about how their brain is kind of pulling a bit of a trick on them in a way.
Okay, thank you. Another question here is in terms of recommending children between the ages of 5 and 9 to do a 1 minute of silence for those who lost their lives during COVID. It's something that's happening in Quebec. Do you recommend that parents do this with their children? Should they talk to their children about it, or just opt out?
Well, 5 to 9 is a pretty big spread. And then, of course, within that individual. So I would say you as a parent probably know what's best for your child. If that's not something that you feel like your child can sort of metabolize, then I would say it's okay to opt out. Um, if it's something that you feel like your child would benefit from in terms of realizing that, yes, we're having a hard time, but so are other people. And, we want to show some compassion for that and some respect for that. If you think that would be useful for your child, I could see the value. I mean, that's pretty young, in my opinion, to do something like that. So I think you would have to feel like it's really a fit for your particular kid.
Okay. Another question we have here is how does a parent modify a child's self-talk when it is counterproductive? So incoherent with resilient behavior.
Um, I think what you can do, I don't know the age there, but I think what you can do is really sort of think out loud that, again, like with your kid. And I do this a lot with my clients, that I don't say, I have all the answers, here they are, as much as I share the questions. So I say, I hear you saying that this is, you feel like you're not going to get into as good of a college as you would have otherwise because of this situation. And I can understand that concern, but I'm sitting here wondering, is that really true? And, are there ways that maybe you'll have more to say on an essay than you might have otherwise? Or that, are there things that you've learned or ways that you've grown that maybe are more important than pre-calc this year? And just to kind of think aloud, that to not pretend like I know and you don't, as much as I say, I'm not really sure about what you're telling me. So let's sort of chew on this together. And your child doesn't have to agree with you to have still heard what you said and think about it later. And so that's often true with clients, of that you just kind of put it out there as something that I'm puzzling, I'm thinking it over, I'm thinking about what you said, and maybe it's right, but I'm not really sure. And that just opens up that this is something to ponder rather than something to just, assume and move on from. I did see a little bit above in that question about managing being in a small space with a sibling. So that's a great question. One thing about, I know you're not asking about the ACEs per se, but one thing about Supernormal, it talks a lot about serious sibling problems, which is not necessarily what you're referring to here, but the point being that we don't talk enough about how sometimes kids really need help dealing with their siblings, or they need to be protected by a sibling who's maybe more intense or more intrusive or older or bossy or more needy, or whatever the case may be. And so I think that it's absolutely okay to say, we need to figure out a way for you to feel like you have the space that you need away from this sibling. And, whatever that is, of alternating use of rooms, or I know it's still cold there, but getting outside and meeting up with kids down at the end of the street, and just helping that kid get space from the sibling, because I think sometimes we forget how much brothers and sisters need that.
One of the other questions I have here is how can I determine if a child is resilient or they are just laid back / unattached?
I guess I'm wondering if it matters, that I know what you mean. I have a very laid back child. And I don't know that she's, deeply engaged in fight or flight or tending and befriending, as much as, she just goes with the flow, which is, its own way of being resilient. So unless you feel like what's going on is the person is sort of denying or not able to like talk about what's bothering them, then I might actually reflect back of, I can see where your temperament, you're so laid back and so go with the flow, and that seems to be serving you well in this situation.
So you wouldn't push.
No, not unless you feel like they're just denying, no, this isn't bothering me. Everything's fine. I don't care about the pandemic. That's a very different presentation from like, I'm fine, it's okay. And I mean, I have seen it with my students and clients and with my kids that, I mean, it's so interesting how the pandemic is intersecting with all of us so differently.
What type of help, and it goes back to one of the questions I was asked, would you recommend if you do have a child who is, no, I'm fine, like the pandemic is fine, and doesn't give you that sense of being just, relaxed and go with the flow?
Depending on the age, if they're younger, I might say, well, you might be fine, but I know some other kids are really struggling right now. They're really missing their friends, or they're really tired of being at home with their brother or their sister. Or so you can say, it may not be bothering you, but I know some other kids that it's bothering, or I've heard that it's bothering some other kids. And, just to kind of put it out there that it's normal and expectable to be bothered. I mean, if anybody comes out of this year and says say they had like no gripes, no complaints, no problems, I would find that hard to believe. Even my laid back child, I think, would not say that. So I think with younger kids, you could say, well, I know a lot of other kids are really struggling. I thought maybe you might be having a hard time too, just to put it out there as a possibility. I think with an older kid, like a teenager, I would say, I hear you saying that, but I guess I'm just not really, it doesn't really feel like that's the whole story. And just to see, and again, they may not say, well, let me tell you the whole story now, as much as they've kind of heard you say, I'm paying attention, and I'm just concerned that there's more to it than you're saying. And, I don't want you to be alone with that.
Great. Last question that I have here, unless there are some more that pop up. Is there a difference between adapting, coping, and being resilient?
I don't know. I don't think so. Actually, I won't bore y'all with an extremely academic conversation about the word resilience and about how a lot of researchers just want the word to just go away because it has so many different meanings to different people. And I think it is the same thing as adapting well and coping well. And again, what well is depend, some days you're adapting well, but other days you're not. Doesn't mean you're not resilient that day. It just means you're having a harder time adapting that day. So I think it's more important to remember what resilient isn't. It isn't bouncing back, that people are not going to bounce back from any of the ACEs. They may make it look that way because they're so good at being resilient that they look like, they just got through all this, no problem. But that's because they make it look easy. It isn't easy. And I know that because they come into my office and they tell me what it's really like, and that they've struggled. So resilience isn't bouncing back. It isn't just being gritty all the time, because that's going to wear you down eventually. And, it isn't being unaffected. I think people imagine like, oh, if my kids are really resilient, they'll just be unaffected. And that I would be more concerned about that I think if you go back to what the 10 statements were that resilient people agree with, they talk about, I can handle things, I can deal, I can get through things, I believe in myself, that there's sort of a active adaptation versus I'm unaffected, because I think that's people are rarely unaffected by the adversities we've talked about tonight.
Well, thank you so much. If there's no other questions, I'm going to hand it over to Amy Shapiro.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Shapiro, and I'm the manager of group services at OMETS. I'd like to ask if you can please take a few seconds to just answer the 3 poll questions, which will appear, which are on your screen right now. So if you could just take a few seconds to complete the poll. In addition to Dr. Jay, I would also like to thank the organizers and our partners at OMETS, Federation CJA, and EPCA, and particularly to the Shapiro family, who ensures public access to knowledge by sponsoring engaging and insightful speakers. To continue the conversation Dr. Jay has started today, we invite you to join our parenting group program at OMETS. Groups are led by a professional facilitator and are formed for parents with children of similar ages from preschool to high school. Parenting groups are currently being held online. For more information about how to take part in a group, please send an email to amy.shapiro@omets.ca. Furthermore, an online group to support children's emotion regulation is being offered at our affiliated clinic, Clinique Entour Famille. This 8-week workshop is an online, interactive, and engaging social skills and emotion regulation program for children in grade 2 through grade 5. For more information about the group and how your child can participate, please visit entourfamille.ca. It's written in the chat. And thank you again, Dr. Jay, for such an enlightening presentation. I'm sure that our parents will take your insightful messages to heart, including the following. Resilience is not about bouncing back. Resilient people struggle. They are strong, but not invulnerable. Also, having positive relationships has an enormous impact on children's ability to adapt well. And finally, the pandemic as a public and shared adversity presents an opportunity for growth. We hope to see you all at our next virtual lecture. Thank you very much and good night.